Thank you all so much for coming. I was going to start out with kind of just like some basic information and then kind of go around my pieces in the show with you all and kind of talk about them individually and see if anyone had questions. I went to the College of Charleston in South Carolina for undergrad, and then I went to the University of Tulsa for grad school. I actually have an MFA in painting with a minor emphasis in printmaking, so it kind of took me a while to get to embroidery. I've always been really interested in textiles. My grandma was a home economics teacher, so I learned to sew when I was 6 or 7, but it was mostly like making clothes or like toys or kind of like things like that. I, for some reason, never took art in like high school. I did journalism and stagecraft, and so kind of like building things and makes like lots of hands-on things, but for some reason I went to school for graphic design. I'm really sorry, that's like, okay, I'll try this again. So I went to school for graphic design, and I just found it like really boring. It was like designing like labels for like toilet paper and just like not, in my mind I was like, I'll be like magazine covers, and like it was not that. But so I had 2 professors kind of in the fine arts department that like really influenced my life a lot. I would probably not be an artist today without them. For some reason, I just like had this picture in my mind that artists are like born artists, or I don't know, I just didn't see myself as being one. But I had these 2 professors that were like very different. One like encouraged a lot of experimentation and playing with things. And the other was like really rigorous and kind of emphasized like craft and kind of doing things just like the right way. I'm having like a trouble finding the words that I want. But so they were Tom and Setsuko, and so I have always kind of had this like, most of my art is just like experimentation and kind of play. Like I don't really set out to make kind of formal pieces, I guess, like they turn out that way. And then my other professor, I remember like we spent a whole semester just drawing white shapes and like getting the shadows on the shapes and getting, you know, just like, I guess like the perfectionism. So like having that like intense like experimentation and playfulness kind of combined with like the really rigorous structure and like formal elements of art, I think has had kind of like a lasting impact on how I think about art today, if that makes sense. So anyways, I went from kind of painting with watercolor and then ended up painting with oils. And then I kind of decided that I wanted to, this was it, like I started out going to a tech school. And I decided I wanted to transfer to the College of Charleston. So I started out doing sculpture, which was not my thing. I'm not good at sculpture. Specifically, I thought I was going to be a good welder for some reason. I am not. I'm a very bad welder. I squashed my initial art dreams. But I just like kept going and playing with things. So I started kind of playing around with fabrics in my paintings and collaging them with medium, and then kind of transitioned into that same thing at the University of Tulsa. When I got to TU, I kind of discovered a new artist that has had a big impact on my work. I don't know if you guys know of Charles Birchfield. He's an American painter. So when I was kind of collaging with fabrics, I was using patterned fabrics and kind of painting on top of them. But Birchfield's work has like a lot of patterns in it. Specifically, he would kind of like go out into the woods and like his paintings would reflect like the sounds and nature that he heard, like bug sounds, leaves, wind, all of that. And so I kind of started thinking about, I wanted to work with patterns and think about patterns in landscape. So kind of through that is how I kind of started creating the characters that are kind of in the works that you see now. There was like a really long evolution to kind of get there. So I kind of started making my own characters, a kind of library to pull from. And then around the same time, I was really into surrealism. It's like Salvador Dali has always been one of my favorite artists. But I also discovered another artist, Neo Rausch, that I love. And so just kind of like experimenting with my own library, looking at a lot of other artists. And that's just kind of how I got to where I am today. Let me look at my... Oh, so the other thing I wanted to say is because I was initially a painter, I started out making embroideries. This is kind of weird. In my paintings, I always painted like a lot of washes and a lot of layers, and I really wanted to paint like bolder kind of like characters. And so I thought that embroidery would be like a fun way, because like you can't blend embroidery like you can paint. Like I started doing it as a way to like force myself to not rely so heavily on like washes and these like nice blends. And so I kind of was painting and doing embroidery at the same time, and the two mediums, because they're so different, they kind of influenced each other. And kind of really impacted my style in like a way that I would not have expected. So I think it's just kind of fun to like treat art as a practice and see where the practice takes you, versus kind of like, I feel like when I was younger, I had this like image of what I wanted to make and kept trying to make that thing, instead of just kind of like letting myself make things and letting it come to me naturally. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions kind of like generally before we start kind of going around and I'm not just like walking around talking to myself? Okay, that's totally fine. So we can kind of like look at these pieces first since we're over here, if everyone's okay with that. So this piece is called A Veil of Silence. One other thing that I think a lot about when I embroider is I'm really into kind of like medieval art and Renaissance art and kind of like illuminated manuscripts, specifically because of like how they organize space. So like when you look at like a lot of Renaissance art, a lot of times they didn't have like perspective figured out yet. So kind of like how we would think of objects today, like the biggest object is usually like the one that's closest to us. But they would organize things based on kind of importance and to tell a story. So like, you know, like if you see an image of like Jesus and like the apostles, like Jesus is always bigger than they are, even if they're in the same room. And so I kind of think about organizing space differently when I work, if that kind of makes sense. So this piece is, they're all kind of sad, I'll be honest. I chose the term rose-colored glasses because, like, embroidery, you have, your palette is chosen for you, and, like, it's hard to get sad embroidery colors, if that makes sense. Like, they're really bright for the most part, but a lot of the things that I make art about are kind of, like, sad and really depressing. My husband constantly tells me I read the news too much. But so I kind of started this specific character here, you'll notice repeats a lot in my work. This kind of person that usually doesn't have like eyes or a face or features, usually kind of like represents a woman kind of in a dress and like bent over. It just kind of represents, I feel like, kind of like the heaviness of like being a woman or being kind of like an LGBT person. And so I just kind of have this like recurring character, I guess is where I was going with that. Just kind of like the extra weight sometimes of like who we are, that we like carry around with us, and then kind of like how that impacts our life. The specific story of this one is me. A lot of times they're not always me, but this one is kind of me and my daughter when I was like going through a hard time. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about this specific piece? You want to know? No? Okay. So I was trying to play around with different colors on this one too, and with fabric paint and layering. Can I pull it off the wall? Okay. Kind of one thing I'll say, just kind of going with what I was saying about like experimentation, is my backs are always a hot mess. I don't do embroidery, I guess, the way that you're kind of supposed to. I look up techniques and I kind of use them as like a starting point, but I really just kind of have fun and play with the thread. So I just thought I would show you guys that. We can move on to this one that is, it's titled, I Want to Be Present. I really wanted to make a piece just kind of about how overwhelmed I felt, just kind of like being a mom and working, and then just kind of like coming off of the pandemic and moving to a new house. And I guess I was just like in a lot of transition in my life that I wasn't like sure how to process. And I just kept wanting to be present and be in the moment and kind of like enjoy things. But I just kept finding all these other things that were kind of mentally pulling me out of that. So you can see that it says like, I want to be present, really obviously, but then I've kind of put these other things that kind of like mentally weigh me down. But the sink is full of dirty dishes, but I feel so angry, but there isn't enough time. Just kind of all these things, just kind of an exercise in trying to help myself like let those things go. And then I don't know if you guys have been around to see the back, but I hand painted the back. And it's just kind of another person being torn, right? Because as much as like I want to be present for like my kids or my family, like I also want time to myself, like time to make art, time to veg out. And so the back kind of represents this like constant like pulling that like I feel, and I'm still kind of working on how to like deal with and live with. And so then I've got kind of my little trees poking back here. The murals I made after we kind of installed this show. They weren't really pre-planned. I just kind of made them to go with the pieces that they were close to. And then we can move over here to my little fabric pieces. So I sew a lot of my own clothes. I'm very anxious, and one of the things that I get like extra anxious about is kind of like climate change and the environment, and plastics, because again, I read too much. And so kind of sewing my own clothes and using like sustainable fabrics, things that like biodegrade has been like a way for me to kind of like cut down on that anxiety and kind of noise in my brain. So these are two patterns that I designed and kind of stitched up. I will probably wear them around town when they're no longer on the walls. But this first one is just like, home is where the dumpster fire is. Because I feel like, you know, home is like magical and stressful like all at the same time. And also kind of like home, like America more generally. And you know, I kind of was thinking a lot about like Israel and Palestine and the war in Ukraine and just all the things abroad. I don't know, just like the weight of all of that. And then the longer piece, sometimes when I make work, it's like more general, and other times it's more specific. This one I kind of specifically made the dress in response to the overturn of Roe versus Wade, and kind of like the ban in Texas and Oklahoma, and just like the idea that like people don't want us to cross state lines, or you know, like this idea that people are always watching you, is something that kind of like weighs really heavily on me. Move over to this guy. A shifting foundation. You can tell there's a trend here. It's just kind of like, I'll move over here. It's kind of the same character again, just like feeling like it's hard to kind of stand up straight. There's just like so many things going on. This is actually one of the older pieces in the show. I don't know, when I make embroidery, I never plan things out ahead of time. It's really non-objective. So I usually start with a central character. So like I started out with this kind of creature here in the middle, and then I just kind of, depending like, is this a sad story? Is this like a really heavy story? Is this a happy story? Sometimes like there's moments of both, right? And so I a lot of times will choose colors or shapes to put around that main character that make me think of kind of like emotions that have to do with like the story that I'm trying to tell. I kind of titled them vague because I don't necessarily want the way that I see the piece or the meaning that the piece has for me to be the same takeaway that other people have from it. I forget, I think it was Mark Twain that said, like, I don't worry about what my stories mean, like I leave meaning for like the viewer. And so I kind of try and leave their interpretation up for other people so that they have lots of different meanings. But I think having this kind of like underlying story or thing that I'm experiencing underneath is what kind of makes them, I don't know the word that I'm thinking of. Yeah. So this one is those who fail to learn from history. This one's a lot more personal, kind of like, I feel like we see a lot of things like in history kind of like repeating themselves right now and kind of going through the same motions, things that I've read about. And so it's kind of just like, it's about like some family members like watching Fox News all the time, I'll be honest. You know, it's like, I'm trying to remember like there was a specific story I got into a fight with a family member about, and now I can't remember and it's gonna drive me crazy. But it's just this idea that, you know, the history offers us so many lessons and so much information, and somehow we keep doing the same things over and over again, and it makes me real sad. This one, they're going to catch you slipping. This one kind of technically, I did some different things that I don't normally do. I played around with like wool roving here and little seed stitches. And I don't know if I remember what this one is about either, which is totally fine. But it's like I have kind of like a library of characters in my mind that like repeat and kind of come back out. I remembered that I had this little guy, this kind of like blue and gray with the wool roving, just like something that morphs and changes a lot. Most of these backgrounds, you can kind of tell this is one of the older pieces in the show too, that it's embroidered on fabric that I bought, versus a lot of these kind of newer ones. I'm designing the fabric in Adobe Illustrator now, and printing it digitally on spoon flour and embroidering on top of it. Did I say that I worked on objectively already? Did I cover that? Okay. But so when I'm designing the backgrounds, like obviously like that's some degree of planning. So the most that I try and imagine is like a time of day or a season. And so like this one I think was meant to be kind of like a more transitioning into winter. So I try and give them like each their own place, but that place is gonna feel different to everybody. Move on to this guy, the Garden of Good Intentions. Yes, and so this one kind of doesn't have a set meaning either. It was kind of more about all the little things that people do for each other to try and help that kind of like end up backfiring, and how sometimes we kind of get in our own heads about our own kind of like actions or things that we're doing and don't always think about how those impact other people. And this one I was playing around too with fabric paint and kind of applique, like putting some type of different fabrics and just kind of experimenting more. This little piece here is another kind of found object. These blue pieces were the scraps from the shirt that I made. And then I also found at my favorite thrift store kind of like these little pieces with the deer. And then also a kit to embroider like this little deer on the bottom here. And it was kind of improv quilting. Again, it was just kind of experimenting and playing. For the words, I wrote, I long for policies that exist outside of politics, identities that exist outside of binaries, and morals that exist outside of norms. Just because like I feel like we're just like with the election and everything that's going on, like we're in this place where, you know, everyone's on a team and everyone is, you know, this side or that side, and so much of life is, obviously I have a team too, like I'm not judging. Like very definitely have a team. But I guess I wish that we spent more time, just like as a people, as a country, as a state, like in gray areas, instead of kind of hyper vacillating towards like one end or the other. And so this was just kind of me experimenting with that and my feels about everything. So these kind of directly relate to the installation that's in the corner there, that if you haven't already, like feel free to like touch and move the pieces around. I called it Exclude and Embrace, just because like so much of our relationships in life, like our friends, like there's like this process of like, what do we want? What do we not want? You know, like our clothes, our food, all of that. And so I wanted to have kind of a piece that people could simulate kind of like one of my pieces. And it kind of has like 3 parts. So it has creatures, resources, and like background. And resources could be like food, or, you know, like materials that you would burn for like fire, for warmth. Like I'm just generally speaking. So I thought it would be fun to experiment with those on like a larger scale. So like my creature here, my resource here, and then kind of like my background like pieces. But I was experimenting with 2D quilting. And so each of these, this was my old bed sheet that I dyed that then got a hole in and became the back of my piece. But these are all found fabrics. They're thrifted as well. And it's kind of the same character. So when I was getting ready for the show, I had a different job than I have now. And I kept working like overtime and working and working and working. And I kept being promised a break. And the break never came. So this guy was just kind of me, and kind of like all the overwhelm that I was experiencing trying to get ready for the show, and like the transitions that I was having in life at the time, and starting a completely new job, and just kind of things that my kids were going through. But I love how tactile it is. All right, let's move over. So these are all the most recent embroideries, and they kind of have more specific stories behind them. I think for a long time, I was kind of scared to make, maybe not scared, but hesitant to make works about specific stories, and kind of kept them like more general. But these, so like Tainted Fruit, for example, was kind of a story that I read about kind of like women in Afghanistan after we pulled out, and just kind of everything that entails, and kind of like the hardship, you know, like the trees, like what more can grow here, which is the title of another piece that's really similar to this one. But most of the time when I embroider, I'm listening to the news. Like I listen to like a lot of history podcasts or news podcasts, and so I think I channel kind of like what I'm like listening to and learning about into the pieces. And then it kind of, obviously because embroideries take so long, like I think I worked on this one for 3 months, but it was kind of as we were starting to pull out of Afghanistan, and just kind of all the different news stories, kind of all kind of combined into one. This one, it's a give and take world. This one's kind of about my childhood. I have an uncle that I was close to as a kid, and we were all making like homemade French fries. He had like a fryer, and I remember like I kept helping cut the French fries, and then we would make them. My brother would like come in and eat all the French fries, like run out, and he wouldn't help. And so my uncle eventually was like, "It's a give and take world." And so it's kind of like my anxiety as a parent and like raising kids, and you know, like I want to impart to them, you know, like to not just give, but to not just take either, but to kind of like, you know, find balance in their lives, like being kind to others and also being kind to themselves. In a world where people are not always kind, you know. And then, so obviously this piece, takers, is the same thing. It's people that just take, and take from others and don't give back. I don't know if I want to go in to all the specific symbology on this one, because I put a lot in there, which I normally don't do. But I think that you can kind of like feel the weight, kind of all the different stories that like go into that one. But I've incorporated kind of like fabric paint here. These like little blue trees were really influenced by Birchfield. I liked the idea of having pieces that were really concrete, that you could kind of see what they were, and then also just having this kind of like amorphous background, like are these trees or are they water? And then is this grass? Are these little, like, what's going on here? It's really hard to embroider on a giant hoop, and I was like, oh, I'll just use a small hoop and move it around and it will be great. And no, exactly, like it did not work at all. That's not how that went, because I embroidered this giant guy in the middle first, and so there was no place I could put the hoop where it would stay even or be taut, because you need them like really tight to get your stitches neat. So I just had to lug this 18-inch guy around for 6 months, or I mean, it might have been 5. But yeah, and then, you know, I got lots of weird looks in the library and things when I was carting it around with me. But there's something kind of nice about it too, just like kind of dealing with like the heaviness of the subject matter, and then also like the heaviness of my wrist and holding that, lugging this giant hoop around. But yeah, it's the biggest embroidery that I've ever made on a hoop. I've made a couple larger pieces with applique, but this one was kind of like a whole new. It's also the most recent one. It's the last one that I finished. I finished it a week and a half before dropping it off. I cut it very close. And actually, like, I kept being like, okay, I'll finish this piece and then it will be done. Or I'll finish this piece and then it will be done. And I kept thinking that at the end of those pieces it would be done, but it just kept feeling like it needed more and more and more. So yeah, I don't ever really know when to stop. I just keep going and going until I can't think of what to add, and then I'm like, okay, we're okay now. So eventually I just put them down. This piece next is another really sad one. So my son gets bullied a lot at school. My daughter is like one of those kids that's friends with everyone and makes like a new bestie wherever she goes. But my son kind of is the opposite of that. And it's really hard to send, you know, your baby out into the world when you know that people aren't kind to them. And as I was making this piece, I'm gonna start crying. It's about Next Benedict, and just kind of, I took a year and a half out of the classroom. I'm a teacher. I took kind of a year and a half out of the classroom working for a nonprofit. And then right when I started teaching again, is when Next died. And I had already kind of started the piece beforehand about my son and just like the weight of bullying. And then kind of like witnessing like the silence within education, like among other teachers, and like nobody talked about it at school. And so the meaning of this one like really morphed a lot as I was making it, to just kind of like reflect and process all of that. Yeah. And then this one is the second to last one that I made for the show, which obviously is just titled The Weight of It All. And just kind of feeling, you know, like the whiplash of everything. And I feel like a lot of people are going through a lot right now, and I just like wanted to like speak to that somehow. But also like, so like obviously like there's this character here who's died. They're kind of like a ghost, like above the other characters. And they're kind of like multiple people all together. And they're kind of falling backwards, just like in kind of like the weighted character, repeating character that I talked about. But they're not falling over because they're holding on to each other. So just like the idea that we're all going through like really hard things. But it's kind of like the sense of community and the people in your life that even if you both have like a lot of weight, you know, that weight can like be counteracted by other people. Yeah. Thank you.